Welcome back to my kitchen. Today I am going to be sharing with you some of the preserving I had on my to-do list this week. I got some water bath canning, pressure canning, some fermenting done, and lots of dehydrating. Come fall, the dehydrators are running almost constantly in our house. First on my to-do list this week was canning some roasted tomato salsa. This recipe is my absolute favorite. It is so delicious. I will say that it's not a tested recipe. I personally feel comfortable canning it with a couple modifications. However, this salsa recipe also freezes really well, so that is also an option. Now, I'll have it linked in the description box down below, along with the adjustments that I make to the recipe for me to feel comfortable canning it. Anytime I talk about this salsa, I get asked about it. Once I had my tomatoes all washed up, I got them cored and onto a couple baking sheets. I also add garlic, onions, and some hot peppers, and all of that is going to roast in the oven for about an hour until it starts to brown. The great thing about roasting the tomatoes is it makes it really easy to slip off the skins. I'll pull off some of the skins that are loose after roasting, but I personally don't mind having them in there. I don't find it affects the texture too much. So after roasting, I let them cool a bit and then pulse in a food processor until it is to my desired texture. I'll hold back a few of the tomatoes to chop the cilantro with as well, and as I finish a batch in the food processor, I just transfer that into a large bowl, and to that I'll add some honey, some bottled lemon juice. You can also use lime and some salt. Give it a taste test and then it is ready to jar up. I do add an additional tablespoon of bottled lemon juice per pint just to increase the acidity, and I'm filling pint jars to a 1/2 inch headspace, debubbling and cleaning the rims really well, and then these are going to process for 30 minutes in a water bath canner. No surprise, I had more beans to can this week. After this batch, I'm calling it. I've gotten as many jars as I had hoped for of beans into the pantry, and at this point, anything else we get is just going to be for fresh eating, or I plan to also use some of them in soups. That's something that I'm trying to get more of into the pantry. I'm trying to do some more home canned soups for quick meals. So I'll use some of the beans in there as well. And I just can my beans in pints. That's a good size for us. Fill the jars up to 1 inch of headspace with the beans, top them off with water, and I do add a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, then debubble, clean the rims, lids and rings on to fingertip tight, and then these are ready for the canner. The beans will process for 20 minutes in a pressure canner. Something got to my cabbage this year, so I ended up not having as much as I had hoped. I went out to harvest and there were quite a few heads that were half eaten, so those ended up being food for the pigs, but it's okay. We still have quite a bit of sauerkraut from last year's cabbage, and I also still have quite a bit of cabbage that I froze last year as well, so we're okay on cabbage. I wanted to make a carrot ginger sauerkraut as another option. I did a smaller batch this time because I haven't made this recipe in quite a while and I wanted to make sure that I got the proportions just right before I went ahead and made up a really large batch. I like to use a food processor because I like a really finely shredded sauerkraut, but you can just slice the cabbage if you want a chunkier one. Now for the ginger, I like to get it super fine, usually with a microplane. Today I just used a fine edge of a box grater, and I also shredded up some carrot and minced some garlic to add in. That all just gets massaged together with some salt and then packed into jars. Press it down really firmly so the brine covers the sauerkraut fully. I tuck in a cabbage leaf over top as well just to help keep the sauerkraut below the brine, and I do also use the mason tops fermenting weights, but you don't need to as long as the sauerkraut stays submerged. I got a quart and a pint of the kraut from this batch, and that's just going to hang out on the counter for a few weeks until it tastes to our liking. We had a frost a couple weeks back. I could have just covered my peppers and tomatoes because it did heat right back up after that, but I am honestly just over the garden at this point, so I went ahead and pulled the rest of our peppers. I have some set aside for salsa as I continue to make it, but the bulk of them I wanted to get into the freezer. I have both sweet and hot peppers to use up. I knew I wanted to freeze the bulk of them, so I got these diced up. I have tried freezing peppers with and without blanching them, and I have found that I prefer to not blanch them. I find they hold up a lot better. I spread them out onto a baking sheet to flash freeze, then transfer them to freezer bags, and we will pull from those to use in all sorts of things. Now, I wasn't initially sure how I wanted to do the hot peppers, so I got those diced up as well, but I did end up dehydrating them for pepper flakes. So next time I would just save a step and I would run those through a food processor to get them to about the right size for the pepper flakes and get them finely chopped before dehydrating so that I don't have to blend them after the fact. Those went into the fridge until I had space in the dehydrator for them. Our grapes are ready, so I wanted to get both dehydrators filled up to make raisins. I didn't do any last year, so this year I'm doing quite a bit of them. I'm a bit more picky with removing the grapes from the stems for raisins than I am when I make juice. It just doesn't matter too much if there's a bit of stem for steam juicing, but I really don't want that for the raisins. So I got those all cleaned up and dried off and then onto dehydrator trays. Every year I forget how long they take to dry. It usually ends up being at least a few days at 135, but this will stock us up well. I also got a batch of grape juice going with the steam juicer. I just did a small batch today with the grapes that didn't fit into the dehydrator. Usually I do a larger batch all at once, but I was going out of town and I just wanted to make sure I got everything I'd already pulled used up. We have plenty of grapes still to be done. Now, I'm really happy with this purchase. Prior to this, I'd make grape juice just in a large roasting pan, covering them with water, and then allowing them to simmer and then straining. But I find that this makes it super easy, no straining, and I do like to set the hose in a jar while it's going because even with the clamp, I found that it will start to leak some. Once the grapes were spent, I got my jars cleaned up, lids and rings on fingertip tight, and these were ready for the canner. It took a few days for the raisins to be done dehydrating. Once those were done, it was time to refill the trays. I got the hot peppers into one of the dehydrators and set that to 125, and they were done in about 5 hours. With the other dehydrator, I got it filled up with some plums to get dehydrating, and as soon as the peppers are done in the other one, I'll be refilling that one as well. Now, once the peppers were done, I blended them up in the food processor to make pepper flakes, and in the future, this is not how I do it. I would just process the peppers before drying, so once they come out, they would be good to go. It was hard to get the texture I was looking for with blending them after the fact, so I'll definitely do that differently next time, but the flavor is so great. I used a variety of hot peppers, a lot of which were Sugar Rush peach peppers, which are one of my favorites, and many of them weren't perfectly ripe, so I was worried they wouldn't be too spicy, but the flavor really came through as well as the heat, and so I'll definitely do this again, just with a little bit of a different process. That wraps up this week's preserving projects. Thank you for joining me this week in the kitchen, and I'll see you in the next video.